At the very beginning of episode 1, you will begin a story called Textbook, based on the Takagi-san manga chapters 61 and 84. Whether intentional or not, this story has some clear commonalities with Eraser, the first story of season 1. However, the differences between these two stories create a contrast that I will talk about later. Another interesting factor to discuss is why these two stories in particular were used to introduce the second season. It's easy to work out why season 1 started with Eraser, because Eraser is the first chapter of the manga. It is literally built from the ground up to be an introduction. However, the manga chapters Textbook and Vertical Text had no such priority, so why were they chosen to be the introduction to the second season? Textbook begins with Nishikata looking nervous over his bag and Takagi asking him what is wrong. Nishikata tries to play it off as though nothing is wrong, but Takagi accurately states that the reason he is acting so odd is because he has forgotten his textbook. Now, of course, seeing him in the first shot, we probably could have predicted that this was his problem. But having Takagi be the first one to explicitly state it lets us in that she is able to read Nishikata like a book. Now, Nishikata's nervousness about having forgotten his textbook would be completely normal for a kid his age until we hear the reason that he is nervous about it. His primary source of anxiety doesn't come from the fact that he won't be able to follow on in class, or even that he'll get in trouble from the scariest teacher in his school, but rather that this will create opportunities for Takagi to tease him. This thought process is here to explain the surface level conflict of the show. Nishikata is often teased by Takagi. He would rather not be. Of course, I call this the surface level conflict because it is only part of what the show is ultimately about, the other part being the budding romance between our main characters. After this, Takagi offers to share her textbook with Nishikata, which would involve having to join their desks together. Nishikata is clearly flustered by this and vows to find another textbook that he can borrow from someone else. Takagi says she doesn't think he'll be able to, but Nishikata doesn't lose his determination. Now, this statement by Takagi is a setup for one of the points that this story is trying to make, which I will get into later. Nishikata's determination to find a textbook to borrow clues us into the fact that the idea of being teased by Takagi gets him riled up. Takagi watching him leave with a sweet smile tells us that she is fully aware of this. We already know from season 1 that she likes him. And watching him get flustered over joining desks is likely more evidence to her that Nishikata likes her back, even if he's not ready to admit that yet. We then get a quick sequence of Nishikata trying to borrow a textbook. Try being the key word, as it seems that no one else has a textbook for him to borrow, except for his friends Takeo and Kimura, who can't lend him their textbooks because they are in the same class. This sequence gives us a quick glimpse at one of the new side characters, Hamaguchi, as well as giving us a little bit more insight into the kind of friendship Nishikata has with Kimura and Takeo. The fact that they make fun of him for requesting their textbooks, but look genuinely worried for him when he seems to be having some kind of nervous breakdown, tells us that these are the kinds of friends that we have all experienced before. The type who will give you a hard time, but will still have your back if you need it. When Nishikata returns to Takagi, she is standing with Ponytail Girl, who actually has a name now. Yamamoto, the author of the Takagi-san manga, released an image of this girl with her name, Sumire Takagawa. So anyway, the fact that Sumire seemingly understands what has just happened between Takagi and Nishikata goes on to further confirm something that I said last season, that Takagi clearly isn't very secretive about her crush on Nishikata when it comes to her friends. Also, the short conversation between Nishikata and Takagi plays off the setup I mentioned earlier. One of the many ways Takagi teases Nishikata is by withholding important information. We see this in season 1 with Kickover, Studying for the Test, Bookstore, Marathon, and Water Slide, and we're going to see it this season in Valentine's Day, Arm Wrestling, Revenge, and Storage Closet. We then get to the moment of Nishikata's first real defeat. Despite having tried so hard to avoid this situation, he still has to join desks with Takagi and share her textbook. He seems as flustered by this as you would imagine, but the worst is yet to come. Takagi shows him a message that exploits his biggest weakness, which is coincidentally her biggest weakness as well: intimacy. Even acts as little as admitting joy about being close to each other. It is at this point that the manga chapter Textbook ends, but the showrunners decided to merge this story with another manga chapter, Vertical Text. When asked to translate something by Tanabe, Nishikata notices that if you read some of the text vertically, it spells out an insult. He uses this observation as inspiration to write Takagi a letter with a hidden message within it. And when he gets a response, he discovers that her message also contains a hidden answer with vertical text. This story is a good example of Nishikata coming up with a plan to win against Takagi, but having that plan backfire. In Season 1, we saw this happen with Funny Face, English Translation, Umbrella, Kickover, Water Tap, Shopping, Horror, and Two Choice Question. In this season, we were going to see the situation play out in Hypnotism, Skipping Stones, Appearance, April Fool's Day, Forms of Address, Arm Wrestling, Bitter Taste, Questions, Dodgeball, The Eating Contest in Episode 7, Storage Closet, Hide and Seek, Steps, and arguably Souvenirs. You know, listing out all these stories has made me realise Nishikata has really gone onto the offensive this season. Good for him. The story ends with Takagi giving Nishikata a letter describing the joy she felt when she received a letter from him and a wish that he will write her again. Despite Nishikata's letter having an ulterior motive, it could have reminded Takagi about the note he wrote to her in seating arrangement, but even I got to admit that's a bit of a stretch. So how is this story similar to Eraser? Well, at first glance, only in very superficial ways. They both start with Nishikata, who is then called out by Takagi, and they both involve an unsuccessful attempt to prank Takagi. However, these similarities are only made interesting by the contrast they have with the differences. First off, Eraser begins with Nishikata trying to craft a trap for Takagi, explicitly not paying attention in class, whereas Textbook begins with him frantically digging through his school bag for a textbook, a more studious anxiety that is only amplified by the possibility of being teased. In Eraser, Takagi doesn't challenge Nishikata when he tells her that nothing is going on, deciding to sit and wait to make her own preemptive move. Whereas in Textbook, she calls out why he is acting strange and almost immediately offers a solution. Even though part of her motivation here is to use this situation against him, she is still offering genuine help. Lastly, both Eraser and Textbook have Nishikata fail to get back at Takagi. In Eraser, his failure is due to Takagi having already laid a trap for him, whereas in Textbook, Nishikata is the one who gets the ball rolling and Takagi is the one who has to react. And of course, her reaction is good enough to lead her to another victory. Comparing these two stories tells us that, whether she is on the giving or receiving end of a prank, Takagi will always win. She really is the teasing master. Another aspect of the overall show that is explored in this story is another point I brought up in my last season analysis, that Takagi's teasing serves to make Nishikata a better, stronger person. Forgetting your textbook for class is bad for a lot of reasons. When I was in high school, forgetting your textbook would not only hinder your own educational capabilities, but the capabilities of whoever had to share their textbook with you. It wasn't the end of the world, but it certainly wasn't ideal. The fact that Nishikata's main concern with forgetting his textbook is that he will be teased tells us that if teasing were not a factor, he would likely be less worried about forgetting his textbook. How much less worried isn't known to us, but it's an example of Nishikata doing his best to adopt positive behaviours to avoid being teased. Even if his motivation is to avoid being teased, he is still adopting those positive behaviours and becoming a better person in the process. Now, one could argue that he only forgot his textbook because of Takagi's teasing, i.e. the push-ups that wore him out. But given that the push-ups are a self-inflicted punishment, I am not inclined to blame Takagi for this. The final question for this story is why? Why textbook and why vertical text? What made these stories ideal to introduce the new season? Well, technically, the full introduction to the second season is the entire episode, not just the first story. But the first story does introduce one of three factors that the first episode exclusively focuses on. The main way that Takagi and Nishikata interact with each other is through games of wit. I know I said in my last analysis that the show isn't really about that, but it is still one of the main aspects. Textbook shows us how flustered Nishikata gets around Takagi and how Takagi is able to toy with him by withholding information. Whereas the vertical text section of this story is a great example of Nishikata going on the offensive and being properly countered by Takagi. So if that's one of the three aspects, what are the other two? Well, join me next time when I analyse Skipping Stones to find out. Now you might be wondering, does that mean you won't be analysing hypnotism? And the answer is, not in the same in-depth way I've just analysed Textbook. I've decided that whenever there is a story that does not warrant a full analysis, I will put it aside until I can gather a few of them to put into a lightning round video. These lightning round videos are where I will discuss the lesser stories of the show. This way I can still technically analyse the whole show minus the B-plot, and I get to focus most of my energy on the big important stories. Speaking of future analysis, if you want to see them, make sure you subscribe. If you'd like to see the outtakes for this video, you can find it on my Patreon. Don't worry, you don't have to be a patron to view it, but while you're there, if you'd like to pledge, I'd very much appreciate it. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time.